In Minnesota, nestled between towering pines and shimmering lakes, there was a small town called Maplewood. It was a place where the air was crisp, the summers were warm, and the stories of the past lingered like the scent of pine needles. Among the town's many families was the Andersons, a close-knit group known for their kindness and their love for the outdoors. However, they harbored a dark secret that would soon resurface in the most unexpected way. Years ago, the Andersons had discovered an old porcelain doll in the attic of their ancestral home. It was beautifully crafted, with delicate features and a hauntingly lifelike gaze. But as they cleaned it, strange occurrences began to plague their household. Doors creaked open by themselves, shadows flickered in the corners of their eyes, and whispers echoed through the halls at night. The family soon realized that the doll was not just an innocent relic. It was a vessel for an evil spirit that had latched onto their family. Desperate to rid themselves of the malevolent presence, the Andersons sought the help of a local shaman. Under the light of a full moon, they gathered at the edge of Crystal Lake, where the water was said to have purifying properties. The shaman performed a ritual, chanting ancient incantations as the family surrounded the doll. With each word, the air grew thick with tension, and the spirit within the doll fought to escape. Finally, with a loud crack of thunder, the shaman commanded the spirit to leave the doll and be cast into the depths of the lake. As the ritual concluded, the family felt an overwhelming sense of relief. They took the doll, now devoid of its sinister energy, and placed it gently into a small boat. They rowed out to the center of the lake, where the water glimmered like 1,000 stars. With a final farewell, they told the doll that they would be back soon, as they needed to use the restroom. They left it there, floating in the moonlight, and returned to shore, never to look back. Years passed, and the Andersons moved away from Maplewood, leaving behind their haunted past. The doll, however, remained at the bottom of Crystal Lake, undisturbed and waiting. Fast forward to the present day, when the Thompson family decided to embark on a camping trip to the same lake. Sarah, the adventurous daughter, was exploring the shoreline when she stumbled upon the doll, remarkably preserved and still looking as if it had just been made. Its porcelain skin gleamed in the sunlight, and its glassy eyes seemed to sparkle with mischief. Captivated, Sarah begged her parents to let her take it home. The Thompsons, unaware of the doll's dark history, shrugged off their daughter's enthusiasm. "It's just a doll," they said, laughing. "What harm could it do?" They packed up their campsite and headed home, with Sarah cradling her new treasure in her arms. At first, everything seemed normal, but as the days turned into weeks, strange occurrences began to unfold within the Thompson household. Sarah, once a cheerful and lively girl, started to behave bizarrely. She would often talk to the doll as if it were a living friend, whispering secrets and giggling to herself. Her parents brushed it off as childhood imagination, but soon things began to go missing. Toys would disappear, only to reappear in odd places, and furniture was inexplicably rearranged. Concerned, Mr. Thompson decided to set up a camera in the living room to capture whatever was causing the disturbances. He hoped to find evidence of Sarah's antics, or perhaps a playful pet causing the chaos. As the family went out for a day of errands, the camera recorded the eerie events that unfolded in their absence. When they returned home, Mr. Thompson eagerly reviewed the footage. His heart raced as he watched the screen. The doll, which had been sitting motionless on a shelf, suddenly shifted. Its head turned ever so slightly, and then, to his horror, it slid off the shelf and landed on the floor with a soft thud. The camera captured the doll moving around the room, playing with Sarah's toys, its porcelain hands manipulating the blocks and dolls as if it were alive. "What the hell?" Mr. Thompson gasped, his voice barely a whisper. He called for his wife, and together they watched in disbelief as the doll continued its eerie playtime, giggling softly in a voice that sent chills down their spines. The next day, they confronted Sarah about the doll. "Sweetheart, do you know how it got down from the shelf?" they asked gently. Sarah looked up at them with wide eyes, her expression innocent yet unnervingly knowing. "The doll wanted to play," she replied matter-of-factly. "She said she was lonely." Panic gripped the Thompsons. They realized that they had brought something into their home that was far from ordinary. The Thompsons spent a sleepless night, the weight of their discovery hanging heavily in the air. Mr. Thompson paced the living room while Mrs. Thompson tried to soothe Sarah, who was blissfully unaware of the growing tension. "It's just a doll," she kept repeating to herself, but deep down she knew that something was wrong. The next morning, they decided to take action. They needed to understand what they were dealing with. Mrs. Thompson began researching the history of the doll online, hoping to find some clue about its origins. Hours passed, and as she dug deeper, she unearthed the story of the Andersons and the dark secret surrounding the porcelain doll. Her heart sank as she read about the shaman's ritual, the spirit that had been trapped within, and the family's desperate attempt to rid themselves of it. With each detail, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The strange occurrences, Sarah's odd behavior, and the doll's unsettling movements were all connected to the malevolent spirit that had once haunted the Andersons. They had unwittingly brought the very essence of that darkness into their home. Mrs. Thompson shared her findings with her husband. "We have to get rid of it," she insisted, her voice trembling. "This isn't just a toy, it's a conduit for something evil." Mr. Thompson nodded in agreement, but the thought of confronting the doll filled him with dread. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across their living room, they gathered the courage to confront the doll. They found Sarah sitting cross-legged on the floor, the doll cradled in her arms, whispering sweet nothings to it. The sight sent a chill down their spines. "Sarah," Mr. Thompson said gently, kneeling beside her, "we need to talk about the doll." "But she's my friend," Sarah protested, her eyes wide with confusion. "She's not scary, she just wants to play." "We know, sweetheart," Mrs. Thompson said softly, trying to keep her voice steady, "but we think it's best if we find a new home for her. She's not safe here." The moment the words left her lips, the atmosphere shifted. The doll's glassy eyes seemed to darken, and a cold wind swept through the room, rattling the windows. Sarah's expression changed, her innocent demeanor replaced by something far more unsettling. "You can't take her away," she said, her voice eerily calm. "She'll be lonely without me." Fear gripped the Thompsons as they realized that their daughter was no longer in control. The doll had a hold on her, and it was using her to manipulate them. Mr. Thompson stood up, determination surging through him. "We're going to put her back where we found her," he declared, his voice firm. With a swift motion, he reached for the doll, but as soon as he touched it, a surge of energy coursed through him. He felt a cold grip around his wrist, as if the doll were trying to pull him closer. The room darkened, and shadows danced along the walls, whispering unintelligible words that echoed in his mind. "Don't!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. "You'll hurt her." Ignoring his daughter's pleas, Mr. Thompson wrested the doll from Sarah's grasp. The moment he did, the room erupted in chaos. The lights flickered violently, and a cacophony of whispers filled the air, each one more frantic than the last. Mrs. Thompson grabbed Sarah, shielding her from the chaos, while Mr. Thompson fought against the doll's sinister energy. With a surge of adrenaline, he bolted for the door, the doll clutched tightly in his hands. He raced outside, the night air biting at his skin as he sprinted toward Crystal Lake. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of angry voices urging him to stop, but he pressed on, fueled by the need to protect his family. When he reached the water's edge, he hesitated for a moment, the weight of the doll heavy in his hands. Memories of the Andersons' ritual flooded his mind, and he knew that he had to do what they once did. With a deep breath, he raised the doll high above his head and shouted, "I cast you back into the depths from which you came." As he hurled the doll into the lake, a blinding flash of light erupted from the water's surface, illuminating the night sky. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and for a brief moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. The doll sank beneath the waves, and the cacophony of voices faded into silence. Mr. Thompson stood at the water's edge, heart racing, as calm returned to the night. He turned back toward the shore, where Mrs. Thompson and Sarah stood, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Is it over?" Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, allowing the cool night air to fill his lungs as he approached his family. The lake, once a swirling mass of chaos, now lay eerily still, reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of glass. He could hardly believe what had just transpired. The weight of the doll, the whispers, and the dark energy that had enveloped their home all felt like a distant nightmare, yet the memory of it lingered, sharp and vivid. Mrs. Thompson knelt beside Sarah, who was still in shock, her wide eyes darting between her father and the lake. "Is it over?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "I think so," Mr. Thompson replied, though uncertainty gnawed at him. "But we need to be sure." He glanced at the water, where the doll had vanished. "We need to make sure it can't come back." As they stood there, the silence of the night enveloped them, broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. The oppressive weight that had filled their home seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of cautious relief. But Mr. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of it. "Let's go home," Mrs. Thompson suggested, her voice steadying. She took Sarah's hand, and together they began to walk back to their car, leaving the dark waters behind. Mr. Thompson followed, glancing back one last time at the lake, half expecting the doll to resurface, but it remained undisturbed, a dark secret buried beneath the surface. Once they arrived home, the atmosphere felt different. The air was lighter, and the shadows that had once danced menacingly in the corners of their home seemed to have retreated. Yet, Mr. Thompson remained vigilant. He knew that evil didn't simply vanish. It could linger, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The following days passed uneventfully, and Sarah returned to her cheerful self. She played with her toys, laughed with her parents, and seemed to have forgotten about the doll entirely. But Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Thompson exchanged worried glances, knowing that the experience had changed them all. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Mrs. Thompson spoke up. "We should tell Sarah about what happened. She deserves to know the truth, even if it's scary." Mr. Thompson nodded in agreement. "But we need to do it gently. We don't want to frighten her." That night, they sat Sarah down and explained the situation. They told her about the doll, the strange occurrences, and how they had to return it to the lake to keep her safe. Sarah listened intently, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. When they finished, she sat in silence, processing the information. "But Daddy," she said finally, her voice small, "what if it comes back? What if it wants to find me again?" Mr. Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. "It won't, sweetheart. We made sure of that. We did what we had to do to protect you." "But what if it's still out there waiting?" she pressed, her brow furrowed with concern. Mrs. Thompson knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair behind Sarah's ear. "We'll always keep you safe, Sarah. We'll watch over you, and if anything ever feels wrong, you can always come to us." As they tucked Sarah into bed that night, Mr. Thompson felt a sense of foreboding settle over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's spirit was still lurking somewhere, perhaps even in the depths of Crystal Lake, waiting for the right moment to return. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly returned to normal in the Thompson household. They enjoyed family outings, laughter, and the warmth of each other's company. Yet, Mr. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he would hear faint whispers that seemed to echo from the shadows. He dismissed them as figments of his imagination, remnants of the fear they had faced. Then, one stormy night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, Sarah came running into their bedroom, her face pale with fear. "Mommy! Daddy! I heard her! The doll is back!" Mr. Thompson's heart raced as he exchanged a worried glance with Mrs. Thompson. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling to her level. "I heard her whispering my name," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "She said she wants to play with me again." Panic surged through Mr. Thompson. He had hoped that by casting the doll into the lake, they had severed the connection. "It's okay, honey," he said, trying to sound calm. "You're safe. We'll protect you." But as he spoke, a cold dread settled in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were far from safe. The echoes of the past clawed at his mind, and he knew they had to act quickly. "Let's go check the house," Mrs. Thompson suggested, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We need to make sure everything is all right." With Sarah clinging to her mother's side, they moved cautiously through the darkened halls of their home. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a mournful spirit. Each creak of the floorboards sent shivers down Mr. Thompson's spine, and he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them from the shadows. "Stay close," he instructed, gripping Sarah's small hand tightly. They moved from room to room, checking closets and under beds, searching for any sign of the doll or the malevolent presence that had haunted them before. As they reached Sarah's room, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt charged, heavy with an unseen energy. Mr. Thompson hesitated at the door, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't let fear dictate their actions. They had to confront whatever was lurking in the darkness. "Sarah, wait here with Mommy," he said, stepping into the room. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting eerie shadows across the floor. He scanned the room, half expecting to see the doll sitting innocently on the shelf, but there was nothing. "See? It's all fine," Mrs. Thompson said, trying to reassure Sarah, who was peeking over her mother's shoulder. But Mr. Thompson felt a chill creep up his spine as he noticed something out of place, a faint outline on the floor, a shadow that seemed to flicker and dance in the corner of his vision. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" Mrs. Thompson replied, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Over there," he pointed toward the corner of the room. It looked like something was moving. Before Mrs. Thompson could respond, a loud crash echoed from the living room, causing them all to jump. Mr. Thompson's heart raced as he exchanged a look with his wife. "Stay here," he ordered, and without waiting for a response, he rushed out of the room. As he entered the living room, he was met with chaos. The furniture was overturned and the curtains flapped wildly as if caught in a storm. In the center of the room, the doll lay on the floor, its porcelain face cracked and eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "No!" Mr. Thompson shouted, rushing forward. He couldn't believe his eyes. How had it returned? He had felt certain that they had rid themselves of its evil. "Daddy!" Sarah's voice rang out behind him, filled with terror. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her small frame trembling. "Get back, Sarah," he yelled, but it was too late. The doll's eyes seemed to lock onto hers, and in that moment, a chilling whisper filled the air, echoing with a familiar, haunting melody. "Play with me, Sarah, forever." Mr. Thompson felt a surge of anger and fear. He couldn't let this happen again. "You're not taking her," he screamed, lunging for the doll. But as he reached for it, a force pushed him back, sending him crashing into the wall. "Daddy!" Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "Stay away from it," he shouted, struggling to regain his footing. He could see the doll's mouth moving, forming words that sent chills down his spine. "Come play, Sarah. I've missed you." Mrs. Thompson rushed to Sarah's side, wrapping her arms around her protectively. "We need to get out of here," she urged, her eyes wide with fear. "No," Mr. Thompson shouted, struggling against the unseen force. "We can't leave it here." With a surge of determination, he pushed himself up and grabbed a nearby lamp, using it as a weapon. "I won't let you take my daughter," he yelled, swinging the lamp at the doll. The moment the lamp connected, a blinding flash of light erupted from the doll, and an ear-splitting shriek filled the air. The force that had pushed him back dissipated, and the doll flew across the room, crashing into the wall and shattering into pieces. For a moment, silence enveloped them. The storm outside seemed to quiet, and the oppressive energy that had filled the room faded. Mr. Thompson breathed heavily, adrenaline coursing through him as he turned to his family. "Are you okay?" he asked, rushing to Sarah and Mrs. Thompson, who were still huddled together. "I'm scared, Daddy," Sarah whimpered, her voice trembling as she clutched her mother tightly. "I know, sweetheart," Mr. Thompson replied, kneeling down to meet her gaze. "But it's over now. We're safe." He looked at Mrs. Thompson, who nodded, though her eyes were still wide with fear. But even as he spoke, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. Had they truly defeated the doll, or had they merely delayed its return? The remnants of its porcelain form lay scattered across the floor, but the air still felt charged, as if the darkness had not entirely retreated. "Let's get out of here," Mrs. Thompson urged, her voice steadying as she took Sarah's hand. "We can go to the neighbors until the storm passes." Mr. Thompson hesitated, glancing back at the shattered pieces of the doll. "What if it comes back?" he asked, a tremor in his voice. "What if it's not gone for good?" "We can't stay here," Mrs. Thompson insisted, pulling him toward the door. We need to leave now." Reluctantly, Mr. Thompson nodded. He took one last look at the remnants of the doll, half expecting it to reassemble itself before his eyes. But there was nothing, just the remnants of a nightmare they had fought to escape. As they stepped out into the hallway, the storm outside had intensified once more, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling like a banshee. Mr. Thompson led the way, his heart racing as they made their way toward the front door. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the house, extinguishing the light from the lamp they had left behind. The darkness enveloped them, and Mr. Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. He fumbled for the doorknob, his hands shaking. Come on, he urged, his voice rising in urgency. Finally, the door swung open, and they stumbled out into the storm. The rain poured down, soaking them instantly, but Mr. Thompson didn't care. He ushered his family toward the neighbor's house, praying that they would find safety there. As they ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows of their home. Once they reached the neighbor's porch, Mrs. Thompson knocked frantically on the door. A moment later, it swung open, revealing their neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, who looked bewildered. "Is everything all right?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "No, we need help," Mrs. Thompson gasped, pulling Sarah close. "Something is in our house." Mr. Jenkins nodded, his expression turning serious. "Come inside. You can stay here until the storm passes." As they stepped into the warmth of the neighbor's home, Mr. Thompson felt a momentary sense of relief. But as he looked back at his own house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. "Daddy, I don't want to go back," Sarah whimpered, her small voice breaking through his thoughts. "I know, sweetheart," he said, kneeling down to her level. "We're going to stay here until it's safe, I promise." But deep down, Mr. Thompson knew that the battle was far from over. The doll had been a part of their lives for too long, and he feared that it would find a way to return. As the storm raged on outside, he resolved to confront the darkness once and for all. "Tomorrow, I'll go back," he whispered to himself, determination settling in his heart. "I'll end this." And as the storm howled around them, he felt the weight of the past pressing down, but he also felt a flicker of hope. They would not be victims anymore. Together, they would fight against the darkness that had invaded their lives. The next morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a landscape washed clean but still heavy with a sense of foreboding. Mr. Thompson stood at the window of Mr. Jenkins' living room, staring out at his own house, shrouded in mist. The remnants of the night before felt like a bad dream, but the memory of the doll's cold, lifeless gaze haunted him. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood behind him, her arms wrapped around Sarah, who was still clutching her stuffed bear tightly. Mr. Thompson turned to face them, determination etched on his features. "I have to. If there's even a chance that thing could come back, I need to know for sure." He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "I can't let it control our lives anymore." Mrs. Thompson nodded, though her expression was a mix of fear and concern. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," he replied, giving her a reassuring smile. He felt the weight of their fears resting on his shoulders, but he also felt a surge of resolve. They had faced the darkness once before, and they would do it again. After a quick breakfast, Mr. Thompson gathered a few tools, a flashlight, a sturdy broom, and a pair of gloves. He felt silly for arming himself with such mundane objects, but he knew that sometimes the simplest things could be the most effective against the unknown. "Stay here, both of you," he instructed as he stepped out onto the porch. The sun was shining, but the air still felt heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. He walked toward his house, each step echoing with the memories of the terror they had faced. As he approached the front door, he hesitated. The door creaked open slightly, as if inviting him in. He pushed it fully open, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dim, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the shadows that clung to the corners. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the silence. No response came, just the soft sound of dripping water from the leaky roof. He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. He flicked on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The remnants of the doll lay scattered across the living room, a haunting reminder of the night before. Mr. Thompson felt a shiver run down his spine as he knelt down to examine the pieces. They looked harmless enough, but he knew better. He carefully collected the shards, placing them in a box he had found in the corner. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Suddenly, a soft giggle echoed through the house, sending a jolt of fear through him. He froze, his heart racing. "Sarah?" he called out, but no answer came. The sound had been too high-pitched, too eerie. It was the doll's voice. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, shaking off the fear. He continued collecting the shards, but the giggle echoed again, closer this time. He turned, flashlight beam darting around the room, searching for the source. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice rising in defiance. "You're not welcome here." The giggle turned into a low, mocking laugh, and the temperature in the room dropped. Mr. Thompson's breath came out in visible puffs as he felt the darkness coalesce around him. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and writhing as if alive. "Enough!" he yelled, gripping the broom tightly. He swung it in front of him, as if it could ward off the encroaching shadows. "I'm not afraid of you," but the laughter only grew louder, filling the room with an oppressive weight. The shards of the doll began to tremble, vibrating with an unseen force. "You think you can get rid of me?" A voice hissed, echoing from the shadows. "I will always return." Mr. Thompson's heart raced as he felt the darkness closing in. "No," he shouted, swinging the broom again. "You're nothing but a broken doll!" With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged toward the box, throwing the shards inside and slamming the lid shut. The laughter abruptly ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. The shadows receded slightly, but he could still feel the malevolence lingering in the air. He stepped back, breathing heavily. "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady. "I will find a way to end this." As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye. He spun around, flashlight illuminating the darkened corner of the room. There, partially obscured by the shadows, was the doll, whole and intact, its porcelain face grinning mockingly at him. Mr. Thompson's heart plummeted as he realized that the shards he had collected were not the only remnants of the cursed object. "No," he breathed, taking a step back. The doll's eyes seemed to glimmer with a life of their own, and its smile widened, revealing an unsettling, almost sinister quality. He had thought he could contain it, but it appeared that the darkness had merely retreated, biding its time. "Did you really think you could get rid of me so easily?" the doll crooned, its voice sweet yet laced with malice. "You're just a man after all, a man with fears and weaknesses." Mr. Thompson gripped the broom tighter, his knuckles turning white. "You're just a toy. You have no power over me," he shouted, trying to summon courage in the face of the terror that loomed before him. The doll tilted its head, the grin never wavering. "Oh, but I do. I thrive on fear, and you've given me plenty to feast on," it taunted, its voice echoing in the empty space. "You think you can protect your family? I will always find a way back. I will always be watching." With a sudden flick of its wrist, the doll sent a wave of darkness surging toward Mr. Thompson. He stumbled back, the shadows wrapping around his legs like tendrils, pulling him down. Panic surged through him as he fought against the encroaching darkness. "No!" he shouted, swinging the broom wildly, trying to fend off the shadows. "I won't let you take me." Just then, a bright light burst through the window, illuminating the room and pushing back the darkness. Mr. Thompson squinted, momentarily blinded by the brilliance. The shadows recoiled, and he felt the grip on his legs loosen. "Get away from him," a voice called out, and he turned to see Mrs. Thompson standing in the doorway, her face set with determination. She held a candle, its flame flickering defiantly against the darkness. "Mommy," Sarah cried, peeking out from behind her mother's legs, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. "Stay back, Sarah," Mrs. Thompson commanded, stepping forward, the candle raised high. "You have no power here." The doll's expression faltered for a moment, confusion flickering across its porcelain features. "You think a mere candle can defeat me?" it sneered, but the shadows around it seemed to waver. "Maybe not," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice steady, "but love and courage can. With that, she took a step forward, the candle's flame growing brighter. "We will not let you take our family," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "We will stand together." Thompson felt a surge of hope as he watched his wife confront the darkness. The shadows recoiled further, and the doll's laughter turned to a shriek of rage. "You cannot defeat me. I will always return," it screamed, but the power behind its voice was weakening. Together, the Thompsons moved closer, united against the malevolent force. "You're wrong," Mr. Thompson said, his voice firm. "We're not afraid of you anymore." As they stood side by side, the candlelight enveloped them, a protective barrier against the encroaching darkness. The doll's form began to shimmer, the shadows around it dissipating like smoke in the wind. "No, this isn't over," it howled, but its voice was fading, growing weaker with each passing moment. The light from the candle surged, illuminating the room and casting the doll into a blinding glow. With a final, desperate scream, the doll shattered into 1,000 pieces, the remnants scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the darkness that had clung to the corners of the room evaporated, leaving only silence in its wake. Breathing heavily, Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Thompson stood together, the candle flickering but still burning bright. Sarah rushed into her father's arms, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. "Is it gone, Daddy?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Thompson nodded, a smile breaking through the tension. "Yes, sweetheart, it's gone for good." As they embraced, a sense of peace settled over them. The storm had passed, and though the remnants of the night still lingered in their minds, they knew they had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger. "Let's go home," Mrs. Thompson said softly, taking Sarah's hand. They stepped out of the house, leaving behind the shadows of the past, ready to embrace whatever the future held.